Take a breath and settle in. Welcome to Metaphysics at the Movies, the podcast where film meets deeper meaning and every scene becomes a doorway to insight. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing someone who doesn't just watch movies, he reads them. Reverend Rich P. is a Unity minister, speaker, and teacher of practical spirituality, known for blending real-life wisdom with metaphysical truth in a way that's grounded, accessible, and powerful. Around here, it's not just about what's happening on the screen. It's about what's happening within us as we watch. So whether it's drama, comedy, or action, Reverend Rich P. helps us uncover the spiritual principles, the hidden patterns, and the deeper messages woven into the stories we love. Get ready to see movies differently, and maybe even see yourself differently too. Let's get into it.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Metaphysics at the Movies, the podcast where we look beyond the explosions, the superheroes, the comedy, and all the Hollywood magic to discover the spiritual truth hiding in plain sight. I'm Rev Rich, and I'm really glad you're here. We've been having a lot of fun with this summer Blockbuster series. We looked at Jurassic Park, The Karate Kid, Back to the Future, and each one of those movies surprised me. I've seen them for years, many times over and over, but when I watched through metaphysical lens, I started noticing things that I had never paid attention to before. And that's exactly what happened with today's movie, Ghostbusters. Now, I'll be honest, when I first saw it back in the 80s, I wasn't thinking about spiritual principles. I was thinking about how cool the proton packs were. I wanted an Ecto-1. I wanted a Slimer. But I did laugh at Slimer in the movies. And who didn't smile when the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man came stomping through New York, my hometown? It was just a fun movie, but years later, watching it again, something completely different hit me. I found myself asking, what if the movie really isn't about ghosts? What if it's about the things that kept haunting us long after the moment had passed? Because if we're honest, most of us aren't afraid of ghosts. We're haunted by our old conversations, old disappointments, old mistakes. Sometimes we're haunted by things that happened 20 and 30 years ago, and even though the people involved have moved on, or maybe they're not even alive anymore, and we're still carrying those moments around like they happened yesterday. I think we all have done that. Maybe somebody told you you'd never be successful. Maybe a teacher embarrassed you in front of the class. Maybe a relationship ended and a little still voice whispered, "See, you're not enough." The person's gone, the moment's gone, but the stories keep playing. That's a ghost. And I think that's why this movie speaks to us more than we realize. Not because it's about supernatural, but because it's about the human experience. So, what was Ghostbusters about for you guys who haven't seen it? And if somehow you've never seen it, as always, I say pause the podcast here and go watch it. But most of all, fix that. I mean, it's one of the greatest movies out there. The story follows three scientists who lose their jobs studying the paranormal activity. Instead of giving up, they decide to start a business. Think about that for a second. Most people wouldn't have said, well, I guess that's the end. These guys said, maybe this is the beginning. There's a lesson in that all by itself. So they started catching ghosts around New York City, and before long, strange things started happening everywhere. People began talking, news spreads, fear spreads even faster. And by the end of the movie, the entire city is expecting disaster. Now, here's what stuck with me while I was watching it this time. The ghosts become more powerful the more attention everybody gives them. I actually paused the movie and wrote down a note. Fear always wants an audience. Think about that for a moment. Fear loves attention. I want you thinking about it while you were driving. It wants you to think about it first thing on your mind when you wake up. It wants you to be the last thing you think about before you fall asleep. Fear doesn't knock on the door. It wants to move in, redecorate the house, and convince you that it's paying the mortgage. And I know that sounds funny, but isn't it true? How many times have you spent an entire day worrying about something that never actually happened? I've done it. Still doing it at times, and I'm guessing you have too. And that's where I think this movie starts speaking to us spiritually. So let's get into the metaphysical lesson here. And metaphysical lesson number 1, whatever you feed gets stronger. If there's one idea I hope you remember from today's episode, this is it. Whatever you feed gets stronger. Now, I'm not just talking about fear. I'm talking about anything. You feed gratitude, you start to notice more things to be grateful for. You feed kindness, and your relationships begin to change. Feed hope, and suddenly possibilities begin showing up that you couldn't see before. And the opposite is true as well. Feed resentment, and it starts coloring everything. Feed anger, and pretty soon everybody looks like an enemy. Feed anxiety, and your mind begins creating problems that didn't even exist. I don't know about you, but I've caught myself doing that many, many times. Something small happens, and before I know it, my brain has already imagined 17 different worst-case scenarios. I call those meetings in my brain. So they call in the cavalry, and all they do is discuss what's wrong with the world. Any of you guys done that? It was an email from your boss, an unexpected phone call, and maybe even a funny look from your spouse. Suddenly, you're writing an entire movie in your head. Most of it isn't even true. Unity teaches us that our thoughts are creative. Now, that doesn't mean we blame ourselves every time something difficult happens. Life happens. People make choices. And sometimes the unexpected things just show up. But here's what we have to do. We have a choice about what we continue feeding after the moment has passed. That's where our power is. Charles Fillmore reminded us that consciousness is creative. Jesus put it another way when he said, according to your faith, be it unto you. Notice he didn't say according to your fear. He said according to your faith. Faith isn't pretending problems don't exist. Faith is choosing which voice gets the final word. I learned the lesson the hard way. There's been many seasons in my own life where I let fear sit in the driver's seat. Maybe it was losing a job, relationships changing, wondering how things were going to work out. And if I'm honest, the hardest part wasn't what happened. The hardest part was the story I kept telling myself about what was happening. And that's what kept me stuck. Not the event, the interpretations. Sometimes this is also known as trauma. It's the stories we tell ourselves long after the incident has happened. But then that's when I realized something. Sometimes the biggest ghosts isn't in our past. It's in the meanings we've attached to our past. And once you change that meaning, the ghosts start losing their power. So here's a question I'd love for you to sit with today. What have you been feeding lately? Not what showed up, not what happened. What have you been feeding? Because those aren't always the same things. Maybe you've been feeding gratitude. Maybe you've been feeding worry. Maybe you've been feeding hope. And maybe you've been feeding an old story that's been hanging around for years. Whatever it is, you don't have to keep feeding it. And that's where we pick up. Because one of the most famous lines in Ghostbusters was, don't cross the streams. And turns out to have a lot more to teach us than I realized. So, of course, number 2 is don't cross the streams. So if you've actually seen the movie, and again, if you got this far and still haven't watched it, remember it's going to be spoilers moving forward. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The team was warning each other, don't cross the streams. At first, it was just technical advice. Cross the stream, something bad could happen. But as I watched it again, I found myself laughing because I thought, we cross the streams all the time. Seriously, think about that. We pray for peace, and then we spend the rest of the afternoon replaying everything that could go wrong. We ask God for guidance and then ignore the answer because it doesn't fit the plan we already had. We affirm abundance and then tell everybody we'll probably never have enough. We say we trust life while gripping the steering wheel so tightly our knuckles turn white. Any one of you guys done that? I know I have. And there's been plenty of times when I'd finish praying and then immediately start worrying. Almost as if I was saying, God, I trust you, but just in case you don't come through, let me panic for a while. Now I laugh about that. Back then, it didn't feel funny. It felt real. But that's what fear does. It tries to convince us that worrying is productive. It isn't. Worry has never solved one problem in my life. Planning has. Taking action has. Prayer has. Having honest conversations has. But worrying, that just makes me tired. I think Michael Bernard Beckwith put it best in his PBS special when he said, worry is doing nothing more than attracting into your life what you didn't want in the first place. Unity has always taught that prayer isn't about convincing God to do something, but prayer changes us. It changes our awareness. It changes where we're looking at. It changes the lens through which we see life. So if I spend 10 minutes in prayer and then 10 hours rehearsing fear, I've crossed the streams. I've pointed my consciousness in two different directions, and eventually one direction wins. So here's a question. And it's a question I started to ask myself, not every day, sometimes every hour. What story am I telling myself right now? Because most of our suffering didn't come from the event. It comes from the stories we attach to that event. Someone doesn't text us back, the story becomes they're upset with me. The boss says, can we talk tomorrow? And this one I've fallen into a lot. You are convinced yourself you're getting fired, and a friend walks past without saying hello. Now you're wondering what you did wrong. Meanwhile, they're just having a bad day. Or they forgot their phone, or they didn't even see you. But we create the stories with very little evidence, and then we believe them. Trust me, I've done it many, many, many times, and I know you've done it as well. That's why scripture tells us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Not because our minds are bad, because our minds love filling in the blanks. And sometimes they fill those blanks with fear. Spirit invites us to fill them with truth. So let's go ahead and look at metaphysics lesson number 3 here. The ghosts aren't outside. Now here's something else that stood out to me. Most of the movie focuses on catching ghosts outside of the people. But in real life, I think those ghosts that affect us most aren't out there. They're inside here. They're the voices we picked up years ago. You'll never be good enough. People always leave. You always mess things up. You're too old. You're too young. You're too much. You're not enough. Ever notice these voices usually sound like someone from your past, but because they really started with you? Maybe it was a parent who didn't know any better. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe someone you loved. Maybe someone who was hurting and passed their pain on to you. The amazing thing is, they may not have spoken the words in years, but we keep repeating them. We become the ones haunting ourselves. I know that's a hard thought, but it's also incredibly freeing, because if I've been repeating those stories, I can stop repeating them. That's what Jesus did over and over again. He met people who accepted false identity. I'm blind, I'm broken, I'm an outcast, I am a sinner. I am unworthy. And before he changes their circumstances, he changes how they saw themselves. Unity says something very similar. Our deepest identity isn't found in our past. It isn't found in our mistakes. It isn't found in what other people think about us. Our true identity is the Christ within, the divine image, whole, loved, created in the likeness of God. Now, I know some people hear that and think that sounds nice, but you don't know what I've been through. You're right, I don't. But I do know this. Your experiences are real. Your pain is real. Your disappointments are real. But they are not the final word about who you are. There's something deeper than your story, and that's the spiritual identity that you behold. That's the part of you no failure can touch, no rejection can erase, and no ghost can steal. So here's something I'd like you to try before we move on to the next lesson. Take out a piece of paper. Write down one sentence you've been carrying around for years. Maybe it is, I'm always overlooked. I'm not smart enough. I'll never change. And whatever it is, write it down. Now draw one line through it, not because it never happened, but because it no longer gets to define you. And because here's the truth. The Ghostbusters never tried to save New York by themselves, and neither should we. So when we cross it out, we know it no longer serves us. So you can pause it here or you can continue to listen to the podcast. But if you continue to listen, then guess what? We are now heading to lesson 4. But I want you to take a quick look at what you wrote down before we move to lesson 4. Maybe it was something someone said to you years ago. Maybe it's something you've been saying to yourself, and maybe it's just something crossing it out just maybe. Crossing it out was the first step toward letting it go. Now let's shift gears a little bit, because there's something else I noticed while watching Ghostbusters. Something I'd never really thought about before. The movie isn't about ghosts, it's about a team. Think about it. Peter Venkman couldn't have done it by himself. Neither could Ray or Egon or Winston. Each one brought something different to the table. Peter could connect with people. Ray had a childlike excitement and imagination. Egon was the brilliant scientist who always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. And Winston, I've always liked Winston. He wasn't there from the beginning, but when things got serious, he stepped in and said, I'm in. He didn't need all the answers. He just needed to be willing to show up. And I think that's true in our own lives. Sometimes we spend so much time wishing we had somebody else's gift that we forget God has already given us our own. So, metaphysics lesson number 4, if you haven't guessed it, is you don't have to do it alone. Can I tell you something I learned over years? One fear's favorite lies is this: you are on your own. Have you ever noticed that when you're struggling, fear has a way of isolating you? It tells you nobody understands, don't bother anybody, they've got their own problems. If people knew what you were really dealing with, they'd think less of you. Fear loves isolation because isolation makes fears louder. But that's not how we are created. From the beginning, we were made for relationships, relationship with God, relationship with one another, and most importantly, relationships with ourselves. Even Jesus surrounded himself with people. Think about that. If anyone could have done everything alone, it would have been Jesus. Yet he gathered disciples, he walked with friends, he shared meals, he prayed with others, he wept with others, he celebrated with others. Why? Because life was never meant to be a solo journey. I think sometimes we confuse independence with strength. And they are not the same thing. Strength isn't refusing help. Strength is knowing when to ask for it. So there's been many seasons in my own life when I've tried to carry everything myself. Maybe you can relate. I told myself, I'll figure it out. I don't want to burden anybody. I'll get through this. Sometimes that came from pride. Sometimes it came from embarrassment. Sometimes I honestly believe nobody could help. Looking back, I realized something. The breakthrough didn't come because I suddenly became stronger. It became because I finally let people walk with me. Sometimes healing begins with one honest conversation, not pretending everything's okay, not putting on the church smile, just saying I'm having a hard time. Those 5 words have opened more doors in my life than pretending I've got everything together. And I wonder how many people listening today need permission to say those words. I'm having a hard time. That's not weakness. That's honesty. And honesty is where healing often begins. One of the things I loved about Unity is that we talk about practical spirituality. And we're not here to impress each other. We're here to grow together. The church isn't supposed to be a place where people pretend they don't have ghosts. It's supposed to be a place where people help each other out and stop being haunted by themselves. Imagine if every spiritual community looked like that. A place where people could say, I'm scared, I'm grieving, my marriage is struggling, I lost my job, I'm trying to forgive. And instead of judgment, they found compassion. Instead of advice, they found presence. Sometimes people don't need you to fix anything. They just need to know they're not alone. There is one of the greatest gifts we can give another person, our presence. Your gifts matter. Here's another thing I noticed about the Ghostbusters. Nobody tried to become somebody else. Egan didn't try to act like Peter. Peter didn't try to become Winston. And each person brought what they had, and altogether, it was enough. I think we forgot that sometimes. We compare ourselves all the time. I wish I could speak like them. I wish I had their confidence. I wish I had their money. I wish I had their opportunities. Comparison is exhausting. And if you check out one of my Take That Truth and Walk With It podcasts, we have a whole podcast dedicated to just comparison. And it keeps us focused on what we don't have instead of developing what God has already placed within us. Paul wrote that the body has many parts and every part matters. Not because every part does the same thing, but because every part contributes something unique. The same is true for you. You don't have to become someone else to fulfill your purpose. You simply have to become more fully yourself, the person that God created you to be. So I want to give you something practical to do. I want you to think of one person who's been on your mind lately. Maybe you haven't talked in a while. Maybe they've been going through something difficult. Maybe you just have a feeling you should reach out. Don't overthink it. Send a text, make the phone call, write the email. You don't have to solve their problems. Just remind them they're not alone. Sometimes one simple message, "Hey, I was thinking about you today. How are you doing?" can become an answer to somebody's prayer. I have seen it happen. Maybe you have too. So, as we move into the final lesson here, and that's lesson number 5 here. Your mind is always creating something. So near the end of the movie, the Ghostbusters are facing Gozer. They're given one simple instruction: choose the form of the destructor. In other words, what enters your mind, that's what you're going to face. So what happened? Ray accidentally thinks about the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and all of the things he could have imagined, that's what showed up. It's funny in the movie, but I wonder how often we do exactly the same thing. Not with marshmallows, but with our lives. Have you ever spent so much time imagining failure that you talked yourself out of trying? Or imagine rejection before you ever had the conversation? Or convinced yourself something wasn't going to work before you even started? I've done that more times than I'd like to admit. There's been opportunities I've almost walked away from, not because they were impossible, because I already imagined how badly they were going to turn out. Nothing had happened yet, and the only place the disaster existed was in my own mind. And that's why this scene gets my attention every time, because it reminds me that the imagination is powerful, not magical, powerful. There is a difference. In Unity, we teach that imagination is one of our 12 spiritual powers. Charles Fillmore didn't see imagination as daydreaming. He saw it as a creative faculty, and it's the ability to see possibilities before they become visible. Every invention, every piece of art, every ministry, every business, every healthy relationship started with someone's imagination. Someone saw something that didn't exist, and that's a gift from God. The problem is that same imagination can envision healing, can also rehearse fear. It can build bridges or build prisons. And it depends on what we feed. And that's why I love asking the question, what movie are you directing in your own mind? It is one where you're always the victim? Or is it one where everything never works out? Or is it the one where everybody leaves? Or is it one where God keeps making a way even when you can't see it yet? Because sooner or later, the stories we rehearse begin influencing the lives we live. So we want to stop borrowing tomorrow's problems. Jesus said something that was incredibly practical. He said, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. And I used to read that and think, that's easier said than done. Maybe you thought that too, but I don't think Jesus was telling us to ignore the future. I think he was reminding us not to live there. How many hours have we spent worrying about the things that never happen? How much energy have we given to imaginary conversations, imaginary arguments, imaginary failures? And if we could somehow get all that time back, I wonder what we could have created instead. That's one reason I love prayer and meditation. They don't erase problems, but they bring us back to the now. Back to where God is, back to where peace is, back to where our real power is. Because you can't change yesterday, and you can't control tomorrow, but you can choose how you're going to show up today. So let's bring it home here as we start to look at, after spending time with this movie, I realized something. Maybe Ghostbusters wasn't really in ghost catching business, but maybe they were in the freedom business. Think about it. Every time they caught a ghost, they removed something that was frightening people, something that kept them from living normally. And it isn't what our spiritual journey is really about. It's about becoming free from fear, free from shame, free from anger, free from the stories we've been telling ourselves from years, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because those things no longer get to run our lives. And I don't know about you, but that's the kind of freedom I want. And the one thing I hope you remember from today's episode is this: ghosts only have power if we keep feeding them. Now, before somebody misunderstands me, I'm not talking about pretending life is perfect. I'm not saying to ignore your problems. If you're hurting, you're hurting. If you experience loss, that's real. If you're grieving, honor it. Unity has never taught us to deny our feelings. We acknowledge them, we learn from them, but we don't build a house there either. I've met people who have built entire lives around one painful chapter. 20 years later, they're still introducing themselves by their wounds. I was betrayed, I was fired, I was divorced, I failed. Those things may all be true, but they're not your identity. They're chapters, and they're not the whole book. God is still writing. Can I share something with you? There's been moments in my own life when I honestly thought, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. Maybe you've had those moments too. Losing people, watching dreams change, starting over when you never planned to, wondering what tomorrow is going to look like. And if I'm honest, there were days where fear was much louder than faith. But here's what I've learned. Fear gets loud when I stop listening to God, not because God stopped speaking, but because I stopped paying attention. And when I return to prayer, really return, not just asking for something to fix me, but sitting quietly, breathing, listening, something changes. The circumstances don't always change overnight, but I do. My perspective changes, my heart settles down, and I remember I don't have to carry everything myself. And maybe that's the miracle. Not that every problem disappears, but that we stop believing we're facing it alone. So let's talk about your spiritual proton pack here. Every Ghostbuster carried a proton pack. And this is a tool they use to face whatever appears in front of them. So they got me wondering what our spiritual proton pack was. And I think it's made up of several things: prayer, meditation, forgiveness, gratitude, community, and faith. These aren't nice spiritual words, they're practices. And the more we use them, the stronger we become. It's just like going to the gym strengthens a muscle, and using our spiritual practice strengthens our consciousness. The problem is most of us wait until we're in crisis before we use them. They're like buying a fire extinguisher after the house is already on fire. Our spiritual life is something we practice every day, not because every day is difficult, but because one day will be. And when it comes, we'll already know where our strength comes from. So in every episode, we highlight one of Unity's 12 powers, and today's power is understanding. I love this power because understanding isn't just collecting information, it's seeing beyond appearances. Fear says this situation is impossible. Understanding says I may not see the answer yet, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. Fear says you're alone. Understanding says God never left. Fear says this is the end. Understanding quietly whispers, this may actually be a beginning. I think about the Ghostbusters. Everybody else saw a ghost. They saw a problem that could be solved. That's understanding. Seeing possibilities where other people only see problems. And this week's scripture, one of my favorite verses, comes from Paul's second letter to Timothy. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of sound mind. I love that. Notice what Paul doesn't say. He doesn't say you'll never feel afraid. He says fear isn't your source. Power is. Love is. A sound-centered mind is. And whenever fear starts talking, ask yourself, is this voice coming from love or from fear? That question alone has changed my life more than once. So as always, I give homework. So this week, I'd like you to give you something simple. For the next 7 days, carry a small notebook or use the Note app on your phone. And whenever fear shows up, write it down. Then underneath it, write one truth that's bigger than that fear. For example, fear says, I'm not enough. Truth says, I'm created in the image and likeness of God. Fear says, nothing is ever going to change. Truth says, God is always creating new possibilities. You're not arguing with fear. You're simply reminding yourself which voice deserves your attention. So as I watch Ghostbusters again, I realize something. Maybe the greatest ghost we'll ever fear isn't outside of ourselves. It's the false belief that we have been separated from God. Unity teaches something beautiful. We are never been separated. Not for 1 second. The presence has always been here. The love has always been here. The power has always been here. And sometimes we've just forgotten. And maybe that's what spiritual practice is, remembering. Remembering who we are, remembering whose we are, and remembering that fear is loud, but truth is stronger. So let's take one slow breath together. And if these words spoke to your heart, then hold them true and share this. But for right now, as we speak these affirmations, I want you to make sure they're speaking to your heart. So say them with me, and I'll pause after each one. I release every fear that no longer serves me. I no longer give my energy to ghosts of yesterday. I choose faith. I choose peace. I choose love. The presence of God walks with me wherever I go. I am free, and so it is. All right, I hope that spoke to you. Feel free to come back to this part and repeat those for yourselves or write them down so that you can have them for you daily. But I definitely want to thank you for joining me for another episode of Metaphysics at the Movies. If today's conversation encouraged you, I'd love for you to share this episode with someone who might need reminding that they don't have to keep feeding fear. And next time, we're diving into another classic summer blockbuster, Jaws. Believe it or not, there's a powerful spiritual lesson hidden beneath the surface of that story, too. We'll explore what happens when fear becomes bigger than reality and how faith helps us face what we've been avoiding. And then until then, keep looking for the deeper story, keep discovering the truth hidden in unexpected places, and as I always say, take that truth and walk with it. Peace and blessings.
And just like that, the credits start to roll. But here's the truth. What you saw in the movie is already playing out in your life. So the question is, what are you choosing to believe? What role are you stepping into? And what truth are you ready to live? That's the work. If this episode spoke to you, don't just sit with it. Walk with it. Apply it. Live it. Let it move through you. And if you're ready to go deeper, more teachings, tools, journals, and ways to activate this in your everyday life, head over to revrichp.com. That's where the conversation continues. Until next time, keep watching, keep awakening, and take that truth and walk with it. Peace and blessings.